South China Sea issue between U.S. and China. We are joined here in the Beijing studio by two Chinese guests. First of all, Mr. Zhu Chenghu, a military expert, also joining us in the Beijing studio. Senior Captain Zhang Junshe, Vice President of China's Naval Research Institute. Welcome. Meanwhile, in the United States, in Washington, D.C., we are having Ambassador Kurt Volker, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, who's also CEO of McCain Institute for International Leadership. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. This is quite a significant visit. Even though it's pre-planned many months back, it is coming at a time when there is an apparent crisis between the two countries, at least between the two militaries. Senior Captain Zhang, let me ask you about this. When the two sides do not see eye to eye about whether freedom of navigation means the U.S. vessels, military vessels, could pass the areas of the South China Sea, which China claims as its own territory. What's next?
Well, I think the United States has seriously challenged China's sovereignty and security, and also threatens China's security and sovereignty, especially in the South China Sea issue, by sending its warship into the waters near the Chinese national islands. This is not a friendly action. It is a severe political and military provocation against China.
I see. That's exactly the words used by the Chinese military officials when they were meeting earlier today with Admiral Harry Harris. In that regard, Ambassador Volker, what's next for Washington, especially Pentagon? What kind of decisions do they think would be appropriate in terms of still maintain possible peace in the South China Sea, at least between China and the United States?
Right. Well, I think it's very constructive and very useful that Admiral Harris is visiting China. I think it's very important that we keep open channels of dialogue. I think also it's very important that we're able to discuss these issues in a way that is not threatening, but that makes clear that there are some very different points of view. What China has done is assert a claim to both the islands and to the territorial water that no one agrees with. And the principle in navigation going back centuries has been that in international waters, every country, whether it's China or the United States or Philippines or Great Britain, every country has a right to put its vessels, both military and civilian, in international waters. And that is how the rest of the world views these waters. It's only China that is changing its actions. It has claimed these islands and these waters for a long time, but so have other countries. And China's the one that is asserting this unilateral identity. The United States and others are maintaining what had been the status quo.
Right. Okay.
And I think it's very important that we continue to talk about it.
Ambassador Volker, I want to push a little bit further about not just putting out all the reasonings from both sides, because we've been doing that for months, if not 1 or 2 years, but rather at this moment, what to do next, and how can we, on the two sides with their own principles, still avoid any possible conflict. That's the thing that we are thinking about these days. We heard already from Admiral Harry Harris today in Beijing, talking about the U.S. will come back. It is likely to be twice quarterly a visit to the South China Sea. Do you see much chance of conflict as a result of this? What kind of scale of conflict do you perceive from your military knowledge that this could eventually, in fact, at certain point lead to?
Well, I don't think either side wants a conflict, so that's the first thing. Neither side is seeking a conflict with the other. We're trying to find ways of cooperating with one another. I think it's quite natural that the United States would continue to have its Navy in international waters in East Asia, as China does and as others do. And I think by good communication, we can avoid those navies coming in conflict with one another.
General Zhu in Beijing, will good communication, will quote-unquote transparency be able to prevent us from any possible real conflict? no matter how big or small the consequences are, once conflict really happens, it's going to put a dampened impact on the bilateral relations. General Zhu.
Yes, of course. I think we cannot rule out the possibility of accidental exchanges of fire in South China Sea. To be very frank, I think this intrusion by the United States on October 27th is actually a very, very serious provocation. I don't think the action itself, but the behavior is very, very unacceptable to the Chinese. Just like a hooligan who raped a man's wife, and now he declared openly to the public, to the society,
your US
and then
counterparts would agree with that. But my question more is about how can a crisis or any conflict of any size be avoided? What can we do on both sides through transparency, so-called through dialogues?
I don't think transparency is a way to address this sort of crisis.
What is then?
I think the problem lies in the fact that both sides should restrain themselves. To be very frank, China has never declared a baseline, so why do you say that China changed the status quo? It is the United States changed the status quo. For example, changed the boundary line of the Philippines. So they had a treaty in 1898 between United States and Spain.
Okay, we got your reasoning. Once again, Senior Captain Zhang, what can be done? If it is not easy to answer that question, let me rewind the tape a little bit. About a few weeks ago, when the U.S. vessel Lawson did visit the South China Sea in the name of freedom of navigation. It was there, and two Chinese ships, one also a destroyer, the other is a different size of ship, monitored the U.S. ship until it left the area. Is this, what kind of level of this do you think, Senior Captain Zhang? Will this be in terms of China's reactions to, let's say, seeing a similar level of, quote, provocation as the Chinese see it from the U.S. side?
Well, first I want to point out that the so-called freedom of navigation operations conducted by the U.S. naval warships are not conducted in international waters. Most of them are conducted in other countries' territorial waters. The U.S. side is conducting such kind of operations on the excuse of innocent passage, but they ignored the legitimate right of the coastal state to formulate some laws and regulations to guarantee the exact innocent passage of other warships through their territorial waters.
All right, that is understand from the Chinese side. Then what can be the response from the Chinese side? I'm not here to test the waters here, but rather to have an intellectual debate about what two sides can do to avoid a conflict that both sides do not want to happen, at least at this moment. So what can the two sides do? From your perspective, Senior Captain Zhang, what is the realities that we're facing?
Well, to be honest and to be frank, that China has exercised great restraint during this incident when the U.S. sent its warships to invade into China's or intrude into China's waters, especially the waters near the Chinese national islands. The warships of the Chinese side only gave the warnings to the U.S. warships. But next time, we will take all the necessary measures to safeguard the safety of the personnel and installations on these reefs, and also safeguard the national sovereignty. We will take all the necessary means.
Ambassador Volker, having heard that, I want to come to you. What is the U.S. expecting when it already claims that it's going to have, even with certain degrees of transparency, it seems, more visits into the disputed territory, the South China Sea? As far as we know, there are certain kinds of military agreements Ambassador Volker, you are much more an expert than I do, about UNCLOS, about some of the unexpected, so-called unplanned encounters, about crisis hotlines. Will these mechanisms really help us when crises really happen in the sea, when crisis really happens in the air? Are we equipped with the real thing at this moment? Ambassador Volker, from your perspective. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I think some of the things you mentioned are quite useful devices for communication. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea provides the ground rules, including those that the U.S. is adhering to, even though we have never ratified that treaty. We apply the rules of that treaty anyway. And that talks about what are territorial waters, what are international waters, and how ships behave in those areas. In addition, we have a lot of means of direct communication among the navies. We have crisis management procedures. We have search and rescue procedures in case there's an accident of any kind. There's a great deal of opportunity to communicate. And what I think the U.S. is expecting, that was your first question, is that we would continue to have peace and we would continue to have open access and open navigation in these waters in East Asia as we have had for decades and even centuries. And that's what we would continue to expect. I appreciate that your guests in Beijing are also speaking with a great deal of restraint. No one is threatening the use of force, and I think that's a very good thing. Certainly the U.S. is not threatening that either. It's simply a matter of open communication and maintaining the stability that we've had for so long.
Senior Captain Zhang, of course the U.S. counterparts have been talking about not to let the things that the two countries, the two military disagree with one another, to impact on the possible progress on the things that the two militaries and the two countries agree on one another. That, of course, is a beautiful hope. But on the other hand, how shall we understand the still possible exchanges between the two militaries? Well, a possible crisis is still in boiling. Meanwhile, how will we see the RIMPAC, which a joint military exercise in the sea, China being invited next year also, likely to help the two countries establish at least some degrees further trust, if I could luxuriously use that word?
Well, I think the recent frequent military-to-military contacts exchanges between our two militaries demonstrate the common desire of both sides to properly manage and control the disagreements and differences between our two sides. And I think the development of the military-to-military relationship is in the interest of both sides. And in the future, we can have more talks and exchanges so as to reduce the possible misunderstandings between our two sides.
General Zhu, though, will the speed of trying to establish at least the trust catch up with the speed to prevent crisis at this moment, for example, about South China Sea and some of the other areas, the speed for that?
I think the exchanges are very important, and the measures, for example, the CBMs are also very important. But I believe that one of the important measures we should respect, we have to adhere to, is mutual respect. Without mutual respect, I don't think any CBMs or any actions which might be conducted between the two militaries will work very effectively.
At this moment, we expect the defense ministers coming from China, US, and also from some of the Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN countries, are gathering in Malaysia, likely to put out a statement. Whether it's going to include South China Sea or not is going to be a very controversial issue. Ambassador Volker, once again, I want to come back to this very essential point. What can all sides do, whether they're in the region or from outside the region like the United States, at this critical moment to make sure we're not putting ourselves into some unnecessary crisis?
Well, I think probably the most important thing in that respect is to avoid initiating any use of force. And I think that is something both sides have done, something that I think both want to continue to do. And I think that's what we should expect. So refraining from any use of force. The next is to recognize, as your guest in Beijing said, that we do need to have mutual respect, and therefore to recognize that many states in the region have different points of view about the status of territories, about the status of waters, and that to assert one unilateral point of view would be really not showing the respect to the others. These things do need to be worked out through dialogue and discussion, and not through any kind of use of force.
Senior Captain Zhang, final words.
Yes, the United States should respect the joint efforts between China and ASEAN countries to peacefully resolve this dispute. Don't meddle in this dispute. Don't provoke tensions in the South China Sea.
All right. Senior Captain Zhang Junshe from Chinese Navy and General Zhu Chenghu, our military expert. Meanwhile, Ambassador Kurt Volker from Washington, D.C., former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts.